So we are going to get started now. And this lecture is actually partly thanks to a chap from Bridgend, Henri. And I may have had this conversation with Keith as well. And when I actually said that we were going to, Andrea, cut your mic. When I said that we were going to be looking at the archaeological remains associated with Napoleon's soldiers, he said to me, he said, what about a certain general? And I said, what? I knew that some generals had lost their lives in the campaign, but this general is truly a great general of Emperor Napoleon's. So what we're going to do, we're going to, the usual thing with screen sharing. So I need to just get my first image up, which usually takes a few seconds. And then I'm going to ask you all a little question. So I'm just going to get this up here, and everything should work in a roly-mo. And we're finding Zoom technology far superior to Skype. We're not gonna stop our Skype chat classes on a Tuesday, but Zoom seems to be a lot better. And just mention last week, for example, we didn't need a password. We need a password now because Zoom has seemed to have become so popular that you know, people that pay for it, like Archaeology Cymru, we've got to have passwords and stuff. Right, so can you see this image in front of you?
Yes.
This man is known as General Charles-Etienne Gudin. And I know that Keith will probably have something to say about this individual, but it would be a good place to start. Do you know anything about this guy, Keith?
Not particularly, apart from the bits of his body he left on various battlefields.
I think the various battlefields is a good place to start. And the reason why it's a good place to start is that every battle this man fought in was a French victory. And he did leave limbs around battlefields or bits of his body. He had a habit of being wounded. And when he was involved in his last battle, just outside Smolensk, in the first few months of the invasion of Russia in 1812, at the Battle of Valoutina, he was wounded, but is mortally wounded, and alas, 3 days later he died. And the thing that the wonderful thing that this general has in common with Anthony de Lacy from a few weeks ago, when we looked at St. Bede's, was that they both died of battle wounds 3 days after the battle. And parts of them ended up heading back to their respective homes. But this man's heart ended up going back to Paris, where the wonderful Anthony de Lacy ended up going to St. Bede's, and his body completely destroyed by those wonderful archaeologists. But in this case, in the case of the excavations of this wonderful man, his body wasn't desecrated, and his body was treated with complete respect. And we are still examining the DNA associated with his body even today. He died at the age of 44, and more than 2 centuries after the culminating battle of the Napoleonic Wars, research continues into its key figures, and this being one of them. And I'm sure one day in the near future, we'll look at the Waterloo Field Hospital that the archaeologists have been excavating very recently, the grisly vestiges of a Waterloo Field Hospital. And they know it's the Waterloo Field Hospital because there's loads of arms and various other limbs and appendages piled up, isn't there, Keith?
Yep, all found in a big pit.
No, that's in Blaenavon. No, this is the big pit in France.
It's a little big pit.
A little big pit, yeah. So, I think what we need to do is look at a couple of choice images. I'm going to read this text in front of us. Recent digs in Russia and Belgium have turned up significant finds in the grave of one of Napoleon Bonaparte's favourite generals, to the grisly vestiges of a Waterloo field hospital. Researchers in southwest Russia have unearthed last year, may I add, the remains of General Charles-Etienne Gudin, who died at the age of 44, a lifelong friend of the great Emperor Napoleon I. And it's very difficult to work out whether he was on a horse going into battle or whether he was marching with his troops into battle. He was a general that actually fought with his troops, which is something that the Duke of Wellington didn't do. But it's something that this general did. He was actually on the front line. He was the equivalent of some of those great generals, the American Civil War, and when he was mortally wounded on August the 19th, 1812, he lasted for 3 days, but probably in absolute agony, because one of his legs was amputated. His left leg was amputated, and it wasn't amputated down to the heads of the bone. It was amputated into the bone itself of the left femur, which means that that's going to be very painful. And we'll look at a little bit more detail as well. And he was such a notable, great figure in French history, and somebody who none of you have ever come across, I'm sure. That his name was inscribed on the Arc de Triomphe, and a life-like bust graces the Palace of Versailles. So the one thing about this is that the archaeologists have actually been searching for the body of this great general for many years, and they eventually found him in a Smolensk park under the foundations of a former dance floor. And his body was just missed being pulverized by somebody pile driving to create the original foundations for the dance floor about 40, 50 years ago. And he had a damaged right leg as well. And his nickname wasn't Peg. I just wanted to put that in there before Keith managed to chuck that in. Today, 100% DNA fits his profile. It is this man. But he was unmistakable. His heart was removed and buried in a chapel in the Paris Père Lachaise cemetery. And then this is a wonderful tribute to all those other soldiers that have been found associated with Napoleon's campaigning throughout Russia, Lithuania, Poland, the whole. I'm not going to go through all those countries. And it's a little bit of a tribute that the rank and file soldiers' bodies have been excavated, thousands of them, and then eventually we find this figure who in a way is the reverse of what we do in archaeology. In archaeology, what we usually do, we go for Richard III, and then we look at the peasants. In this account, we've looked at the bodies, the mass graves of soldiers from this campaign, and then we see somebody who's at the top of the apex, who was a true hero himself. And he was if he had survived this campaign, it might have been that the Napoleonic War may have turned out slightly different. But that's a sweeping statement. You could say the same about Heinz Gudin in the Second World War if he'd have continued and destroyed the British army on the beaches at Dunkirk. But that's another thing altogether. So he's an aristocrat by birth. And he also went to the same school as Napoleon. But he also served Louis's Guard, and he also served the Revolutionary Guard, and he also served Napoleon's Guard as well. So he sort of served three masters, and he was a military man once and for all. And what do we know about the Russian campaign? If anyone wants a guess, you can guess that up to 650,000 soldiers, men and women, invaded Russia with Napoleon. I actually like to think the figure's like somewhere like 400,000, but that is a very large army, and there's a very large army to keep in the field. It's very rare that we have large armies like that in any conflict. Even the large armies invading Russia in the First World War met those numbers. However, they had access to a railway network, they had access to vehicular transport, They had access to a wonderful state that was able to support them in the First World War. But Napoleon's army was only meant to be there for a short time. The true levels of understanding when we look at this wonderful general, and let's move the image, and there's the excavation. The true parallels between Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the lives that were lost in Russia is very similar to Adolf Hitler's invasion of Russia as well, because Napoleon thought the invasion would be over and done with within months. Adolf Hitler. And the same mistake is always made. Everyone always underestimates the Russians in warfare, politics, understanding everything about the Russian mindset, consciousness, their being, everything. You can very rarely get into the mindsets of a Russian. And one thing I would sweepingly say is that if you wanted to look numbers for numbers, right, the Russians won the campaign, right? If you wanted to look at the fact that Napoleon retreated from Russia, the Russians won the campaign. But the campaign all the way to Moscow, Napoleon won more or less every single battle. You could argue Borodino and so on and so on, but every single battle was won by Napoleon's French. So this is in Smolensk Park, and the very interesting thing is actually that pile there, very next door to the body. Pile driving to create stilts in the mud, to create a platform, to create substructure for the superstructure, and so on and so on. This is what we're talking about. So the body was found. In many cases, they'd been searching for the body for many years, but there it was found. And I think to really give some more credence and tribute to this man and the campaigning, we're going to stop screen sharing for a moment, and we're going to look at a few of my notes, so you can all see each other again, because I know Jim's missing you all. Excellent. So here we go. So hang on a minute. I just lost what I was doing. And this wonderful man, here we go, Charles-Etienne Gudin. So he was very much of aristocratic in birth. He was in the King's Guard. By 1791, he had been sent to Santo Domingo as a lieutenant, came back to France in 1792 to be part of the new Republican Guard. And within Napoleon's Swiss campaign in 1799, battle after battle, he rose to the rank as a general. Napoleon only started off as an artillery commander after all. And he started commanding divisions by 1800, the 11th of July, 1800. And he started to take command. He was a very competent general. And at the Battle of Ostad in 1807, again, he was one of those wounded with the rest of his men. And he would then take place in various other battles where he was wounded. He was wounded at the Battle of Wagram, which is also another famous battle of Napoleon's campaigns. In 1812, he joined the Grand Army, and he was involved in fighting in the heroic Battle of Smolensk. And the one thing about the heroic Battle of Smolensk and the sub-battle of Valoutina on the 19th of August, 1812, was that they should have actually captured the Russian army and destroyed it forever. And Napoleon was very angry that battle after battle, they may be defeating the Russians, but they're always allowing the Russians to escape, which is a sad tragedy of this whole campaign. So it would be best now. I'm going to give you just again to give you some facts and figures. The Battle of Valoutina, the hopes of trapping the Russian army again were thwarted by the incompetence of some of the senior generals of Napoleon's staff. But General Gudin led the assault at the battle of Valoutina, and he led the assault, and he was hit by a cannonball. Now, some say he may have been on a horse. If he was on a horse, then that cannonball would have presided directly into the horse's chest, and stuff would have gone everywhere. But Gudin lost his leg, and he wasn't the only general in Napoleon's campaigning to actually lose a limb via a cannonball. They removed his leg. Primary and secondary infection, gangrene set in. He died 3 days later. But it was a victory. And Marshal Ney naturally took all the credit. And apparently Napoleon wept on hearing the death of General Gudin at the Battle of, I can never blooming say it, Valoutina.
All right, Keith.
So let's carry on.
Hello, am I there now?
Yes.
Can you see me?
Yes.
We can see you,
Yeah, we can
Keith.
see you.
Hooray, it worked.
So anything you would like to add about this battle, Keith?
No, you're doing all right so far.
I'm glad you approve.
4 out of 10.
Well, that's better. That's better than what I usually get. You usually say the classes are rubbish. Oh my God! It's the first time we've ever seen you, Keith.
I know.
Right.
No, it's amazing, isn't it? I'm
Do you
worth looking
know,
at, though.
Do you know what? I'm not going to be out trumped by him wearing his headphones because I'm going to wear mine as well. See, we're real boys here. Right, so there's the excavation.
Oh, hang on. Now you put your headphones on. I can't hear you very well.
Yeah,
You can't hear me.
I'm the
Hi.
same. I'm
Very faint.
weird.
The headphones don't work.
Well, you can't hear you very well. I can hear everybody else.
Hello.
Hang on.
I'm using my headphones, all right?
I can hear Keith well.
Can
Yeah.
you hear me now?
No, not very well.
faint.
Take your headphones off. It works.
Do you know what it is? It's computer technology. It doesn't always seem to work.
Yeah.
Right,
So tell me about it.
You can hear it now.
Yes, we can hear you, mother.
Right, there you go. So, so we're there excavating in the park, and the one thing that you can see is you've got a number of archaeologists excavating the body, and obviously it's being photographed stage by stage. Everything's being recorded, and as we start to move in there, this is mentioned in the Battle of Smolensk, which was the precursor to the battle that Gudin was actually involved in. And the one thing to say about the Battle of Smolensk a day earlier, it was the 16th or 18th of August, 1812, was that in Smolensk itself, after evacuating numbers of the population of Smolensk, the 15,000 inhabitants that remained in Smolensk, only 1,000 were left after the Battle of Smolensk, telling you the ferociousness of French artillery that bombarded the city. Out of 2,250 buildings at Smolensk that once stood on the 15th of August, by the 18th of August, only 350 survived. Battle is not just about soldiers. It's about the loss of life that we find with the civilians. Now, when we actually did the lecture on Tuesday, and we actually did it on Monday, we mentioned the Arc de Triomphe, and the man that we're talking about, Gudin, is all these names of these heroes, the generals, marshals of France, are actually entered on the Arc de Triomphe. Now, the interesting thing is that when we actually looked at this on Tuesday, we couldn't really work out why Gudin had a line underneath his name, and some of the other generals and field marshals had names under had lines under their names. We actually found out that these were the ones who actually died in direct fighting, in direct battle. So there's quite a few of them who led the army who were actually killed. And this is actually, this is enlivened, this is preserved on the Arc de Triomphe. So lots of these generals in Napoleon's armies were heroes. They were war heroes. and they're remembered as being so. And there he is, the bust of this very man in the Palace of Versailles. And there he is, looking at. And actually, he was only 44 when he died. So, and he was a quite interestingly fit-looking bloke, except he was lacking one or two bits of his appendages when he died. And the thing is, when we were looking at this, I had the question thrown at me. The Gudin, is this actually a painting of him? Well, actually, it's this is actually a print. France had publications of their war heroes and their generals, and you'd have these very large publications that, if you remember those old atlases that we used to have and we used to look at when we were children, if you think of something that is twice the size of that, with beautiful illustrations and beautiful color prints in these publications, this is what we're talking about. And the one thing I've got to say, which sort of springs to mind quite clearly in my head, is that when we look at, and I want to know if Keith agrees or disagrees with this, but I'll say it first. When you look at the Napoleonic War from the French perspective, the French immortalize their dead. They respect their dead. They respect their generals. And in respect to those that are buried on the field and being recovered, they're given all the honours and privileges that should be deemed soldiers that have died in conflict. But when we look at the Napoleonic War, I can't say for any other French wars, but when we look at the Napoleonic Wars, but when we look at our own generals and we look at our own rank and file and how they're treated throughout history, particularly from the Napoleonic War, they seem to be forgotten. And when we look at the massacre at Peterloo, a few years after the Battle of Waterloo, was that I think that was in 1819. I think I got the date right there. When there's lots of soldiers involved in the Peterloo massacre, it's almost as if they've been forgotten. When in fact the French were on the losing side. They're not forgotten, and they're heroes and they're immortalized. Is that a right way of putting it, Keith?
Yeah, they're much more. They celebrate much more their military background than I suppose a lot of other countries do. I mean, we got General Picton, who lived just along the coast here and who was killed at Waterloo, but you don't see many memorials for him around here, do you?
No,
Two
you
roads
don't.
named after him, but that's about it.
Can I ask you? This is not too much of a tangent because I've already mentioned it. The excavations at Waterloo are ongoing because I know you go there every year. But can I ask you? French soldiers are obviously being I don't know if they're being repatriated, but they're being given all those honours. Would there be an argument for repatriating some of the bodies of English troops that died at Waterloo? Has that ever been discussed, or is that a possibility?
No, I never have discussed it. There's a church in the village of Waterloo itself where a lot of the senior, generals and officers were buried, and they're still there. So there was not much consideration of bringing them back.
No.
At the time it was difficult to bring bodies back because of the time it took, waiting for the ships and everything. And unless you had a big barrel of brandy or something, you didn't have much way of bringing them back apart from that.
But retrospectively, there's been no talk of that today.
No.
Okay. That's the point. Thank you for that. So a Gudin as well, and what we're now looking at, we're looking actually into the coffin. He was actually buried in a coffin, and there's an interesting point to be made here. We have a more fuller image than this, but you can actually just see the side of the coffin here, and you can actually see some of his upper limbs. And we actually go down, and we'll actually look at the legs and all the rest of it. It looks a bit of a mess. What we have is decaying bone because of the acidic clay. We've got decaying material. It's all in there, and it's in the way of what he was buried with. There's very little left. But there's one interesting point to be made here, and this is a paramount point. This is August the 22nd, 1812. It's not the 12th of December, 1812. If anyone's dying, and there would still be thousands dying on the retreat in December 1812. They were not given any last rites. They were just thrown in a ditch. Generals, rank and file, women, horses, they were all just being thrown in ditches. There wasn't the structure to preserve the modicum of respect for any of these bodies in December 1812. But this is still August. This is still when the glory of Napoleon's army is still held, when they're defeating the Russians. This is still when the sun's out. This is still when there's a baking plain. This is still when there's food around. So this man is given last rites, but nothing afforded to those later on. And again, this is all last year. This is so fresh. I just thought I'd chuck this in there as a bit of fun. There's Gudin himself. There's the archaeologists. You can see a little bit more of the coffin. You can see how close one of the concrete piles was to the grave. And it's quite lucky that we've actually found this individual. Ask me the question, how do we really find great war heroes like this? The answer is a lot of trial and error. And the biggest problem is, this is Smolensk. This is within the field of a number of battles over time. Smolensk has been besieged and fought over many times. So this guy could have been anyone from the Napoleonic Wars, from medieval conflicts. This could have been somebody from the First or the Second World War. This could have been somebody from one of Stalin's purges. But amongst all those bodies, they found him. And I think that gives you the skill of the archaeologists. And there is the body. We're looking down on it. It's not the clearest image in the world, but you've got the right leg, the left leg itself. You can see there that the femur itself, the ball joint itself, is cut above the ball joint. So if you're going to try and suture this, if you're trying to cure it, if you're going to try and sew the head together above the bone, it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be very painful. And so there's talk about trying to reconnect the veins and all the rest of it, so you've got blood circulation and so on and so on, and all these other things. But having a wound like that was almost fatal, and it was fatal in this case. Moving on a little bit more. And there he is now. Whether he was on a horse or he was marching alongside his men, that's debatable. But this woodcut, this clear illustration, is showing the moments on the field of complete confusion. Somebody asked me, and I gave this as a piece of homework. Somebody asked me about, did they have newspapers back in the day? Yes, they did. And I don't know if any of you have watched the Sharp series. And there's an episode of the Sharp series where they portray the Irish soldiers being given news reports, being given newspapers saying that, you know, back at home the Irish are suffering and so on and so on. And there's this little play with this episode in Sharp. Well, lots of things in Sharp are actually based on actual real events and happenings. And yes, they did actually have newspapers back in the day, and there were reports like this, and these reports were going home. But slowly but surely, the true realities of the campaign by October 1812 were really hitting home. By late October, it was a very bad winter. And what did we find with Hitler's invasion of Russia? A very bad winter, hit by very bad winters, 1940, 1941, 1942. And this is the time in 1812 that Napoleon decided to invade Russia, and the weather conditions were horrendous. He actually thought when he got to Moscow in October 1812, I think it was about the 18th of October. We'll look at the precise date in a few moments. By about that date, he thought that the Russians were going to surrender. The old idea that when you go to the gates of Moscow, is that you know, the Russians are going to surrender. This is what Adolf Hitler thought. You know, if you get to Russia's capital Moscow, and you actually manage to capture the city, then the Russians are going to surrender. If Adolf Hitler managed to get to Moscow, that wouldn't have happened. Stalin would have continued, right? And the same thing happened with Napoleon. The Tsar decided to continue the war. And basically, Napoleon was saying, look, you know, let's shake hands, right? You know, you've been defeated. And the Tsar knew something else. The Tsar knew two things. Napoleon didn't have enough supplies. They had emptied all the granaries and everything in Moscow, so there was very little food for Napoleon's soldiers there. Also, trapping Napoleon's army in Moscow would simply mean his army would retreat, and then the Russians had a scorched earth policy. So as the French were marching towards Moscow, behind the French, the Russians were burning all the supplies, were setting light to fields, were setting light to villages. Their own people, they were destroying the landscape because they knew, they had planned them. They had planned this. They planned to trap Napoleon. And then the trap was set. And as Napoleon retreated, disaster unfolded. However, there's one little piece of magic that we need to give you all. And the little piece of magic is that if the Tsar had said, look, we'll sign an armistice, right? Russia will surrender to you, or, you know, will agree to disagree, right? Napoleon's army would have been destroyed anyway. And it wasn't just the cold, it was typhus. The archaeological evidence tells us that most of Napoleon's army was infected with typhus. Basically, those little, most of his army in close proximity, and as the winter sets in, the soldiers are going to cuddle up to each other, right? And their tunics would have been full of lice and all sorts of horrible bugs, which are basically, those are then going to be the transmitters of typhus. And typhus is very similar to another virus that seems to be around at this moment. You don't know you've got it for weeks and weeks, and then suddenly you drop down dead. And this typhus seems to hit after a month. So the whole army might be marching into Moscow quite happily. Then as they're retreating, they're just dropping dead. Their systems are collapsing. Typhus works a bit like cholera. You know, liquids move from all your orifices of the body. So the liquid just leaves your body, right? It works like cholera, right? You can imagine a soldier like that. They don't stand a chance. And there's reports that soldiers just gave up. They curled into a ball and just gave up. And it's said that so many of them surrendered to villagers on the way back that the villagers just lined them up and just pushed them into a hole because they weren't going to care for them either. And it's also likely that those French soldiers that were looked after by villagers, they were either used as slaves or they were used as people to work the land, or they caught something off the villagers as well. So if they had a typhus already, they may have caught secondary typhus or cholera or something else quite nasty like that. So there's no way that Napoleon could have won this campaign. It was over, even if the Russians had surrendered. So let's move on. So Arc de Triomphe. So we see these generals immortalized in the Arc de Triomphe. And again, this is, again, I think this leads us to the point earlier on. You might find English, Welsh, Irish, Scottish bodies at the Battle of Waterloo, but you don't have that sense of a memorial to them. You don't have. You're right about Picton, General Picton. He's a local hero within our landscape, but you don't see the memorials to him, and that's a very good point. But if he was a French general, he would be immortalized. And we see this great monument, the Arc de Triomphe, you know. And I think the only thing that's immortalized from the Napoleonic Wars is actually the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. We see Nelson's column. Yeah, and I'm struggling to see anything else. But so, you know, we've got different ways of treating people in the past, and I think and I think this is very important when we look at this whole history. We're actually going to go somewhere else in a moment. So so this great general, we've done DNA testing on this great general, and what we do find is that testing on this great general is actually being paid for not only by the French, but it's being paid for by the Kremlin itself. It's you know, after that great entente between the French and the Russians, it's there's a very different relationship between the Russians and the French, as when you look at the French and the Germans, for example, and it's because of that great relationship between the Russians and the French that we see the great calamity of the First World War. You know, the Russians attacked the Serbians, and the Serbians have declared war on the Russians, and then the Allies, and then what you've got the French siding with the Russians, and the enemies of the French are the Germans. You've got this whole terrible thing. And I've actually got that wrong, haven't I? Because the Serbians were allies with the Russians, and it was the Austrians who declared war on the Serbians. Sorry for that mistake. I rectified that mistake, didn't I, Keith?
Well done, that man.
Sorry about that. So you've got this entente, we've got this alliances, and that led to the First World War, because it was the Black Hand Principe, and you've got the Sarajevo, and you've got the assassination of the Prince Ferdinand, who was the Austrian heir, was assassinated by the Serbians. Austria declares war on the Serbians, and then that's the First World War. And it's that great thing between the French and the Russians, which has developed after this campaign. And you think that's strange, because the Russians treated the French very badly, and the French treated the Russians very badly, but they become friends. And that's lasted to today, because the Russians have said, look, we've got our DNA experts, let's work out who this individual is. And the Russians and French have worked together, and they've actually said that it's a DNA match. And it's a DNA match that is linked directly to General Gudin's brother. And his family has survived, his ancestors have survived. They've got the DNA, and they've matched 100% that in that box, in the ground, there is no longer any doubt, 100% match. This is the true French war hero. And if you know anything, any more information you want to read about this, is a general known as Louis Nicolas Deveau, who's another great French general, who was actually there at the graveside of Gudin, and that gave an account, and the account basically said that the heart of Gudin was actually sent back to France, and then Gudin was immortalized, but his body hadn't been found up until last year. So what I'd like to ask, are there any questions on that so far?
Do we know what's happened to the skeleton? Have they reburied it or brought it back to France, or?
I think they're still analysing it, and I'm just trying to look at my. This is so recent. It's absolutely so recent that I don't think we can get that yet, because
no.
This was being reported in January 2020, and in January 2020 they hadn't worked out the DNA of Gudin. But this other report, which is just from a month or so after, they've actually worked out that the analysis and confirmation, this is actually Gudin, You know, the descriptions were that, you know, the cannonball had taken away his leg and all the rest of it, gangrene, and they needed to prove this. So the DNA is really, really fresh, and I can't. So I think this is actually February, so I don't think the body's actually been buried yet. But we do know that there are French Napoleonic War cemeteries in Lithuania, for example, and the Lithuanians treat the French dead of the Napoleonic War like absolute war heroes. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to look at this image here, there. Now, this takes us down another journey. And what we're going to do, we're going to take us down this other journey, and then we're going to take a break. Well, go down the other journey. We're going to ask any questions, and then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to come back to this after that. Now, that number of bodies there, in 2001, in one single month in 2001, they exhumed over 3,600 sets of skeletal remains. Each one of them treated with respect. Each one of them who was given a place of burial in Vilnius's military cemetery. They weren't taken back to France, but they were treated with all the levels of respect in a military cemetery in Vilnius. The bodies were being examined until 2015. So if you want, again, you want to compare this with St. Bees, the body of St. Bees was analysed for a few days and then moving on. But the bodies associated with this cemetery of the dead, this great pit in the ground, it tells us so much of how we should treat those from previous conflicts. And I think the story here, which we're going to show on the screen anyway and read out bit by bit, gives the unfolding story of how we should actually treat our war dead, whoever they may be. So let's, I want to, right, so here we go. If I can, no, I can't, I'm trying to move something from the screen. It starts, digging Napoleon's dead. Excavations in 2001, 2002. And we actually reported this when I was editor of Archaeology World Report. It was quite an interesting find back then. Now a prosperous post-Soviet city, the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius has had a turbulent and often violent history. And I would like to say that we haven't completely finished with Gudin because I haven't answered any questions about him. But now we move to the rank and file in Lithuania. Since its founding in the mid-1200s, Lithuania, and especially its capital, was often at the center of conflicts between Russia and Poland, and more recently, the Soviet Union and Germany. And it's Lithuania and the Lithuanian wars, and we mentioned this associated with Anthony de Lacy as well, when he died in 1368. When a mass grave was discovered by construction workers, the section of Vilnius, archaeologists called to the site suspected the bones belonged to the Lithuanian victims of the Nazi occupation. So again, it's a mass grave. These have got to be victims of the Nazi occupation. They've got to be. And there's one thing that the Nazis have in common with Napoleon's troops. They were welcomed in Lithuania when they invaded in the Second World War. They were given all the honors and respect. And then the people were treated very poorly by the German troops. Can't really say about Napoleonic troops associated with the Lithuanians, but we don't really know the story there. Between 1941 and 1944, the Gestapo and the SS annihilated the Jewish community, murdering some 200,000 people. The circumstances of those disappearances have never been fully documented. So these 3,600 bodies must be, from that period. The archaeologists thought they must be. They've got to be. And then somebody said, actually, what about the coal pit could actually be the Soviet Union, the KGB or the NKVD. And it must be the Russian intelligence agency's brutality over 47 years of the Red Army's occupation of Lithuania. It must be the Russians who have created this mass grave. Because it's well known 250,000 Lithuanians were sent to Siberian work camps, or they could have just been disposed of nearby. The location of the gravesite next to the former barracks of a Soviet tank division fueled this theory. So they've got to be from the Second World War. And other people said, actually, they've got to be from the First World War. Between 1941 and 1944, when Nazi Germany occupied Lithuania, the Gestapo, hang on a minute, my screen's got a bit thingy. The Gestapo and the SS annihilated the Jewish community, and not forget Lithuanians, not forget gypsies, not forgetting homosexuals, and so on and so on. Murdering some 200,000 people. The circumstances of those whose disappearances have never been fully documented. In a country that is 96% Catholic and which seeks to distance itself from its difficult past, the Jews of Lithuania are seldom discussed, and nor are the other populations, the gypsies, and nor of some of the other groupings. Even though the city was once known as the Jerusalem of the West, because of its large and influential Jewish population and other populations as well. Excavators feared that the mass grave might contain victims of Nazi oppression. It is estimated that more than 30% of the Lithuanian population perished between 1940 and 1953. Also blaming it on the Russians as well. And then other archaeologists started to find artifacts that were not from the First, which were not from the Second World War. They weren't trinkets of people who were hanging on to lockets and stuff from the Second World War. They were memorials of a much earlier war. And we're going to look at that after the break. Are there any questions on anything that we've done so far?
No.
No.
No. I was just going to say
Okay,
that
so what we're going to do...
Tchaikovsky's... Hang on.
Hang on, go on, Jim, give it to us.
If you've heard the 1812 overture by Tchaikovsky, that celebrates the Russian victory over the French, which is interesting.
It does, and also Leonard Tolstoy, was it 1900 odd? It celebrates. It doesn't celebrate the campaign. It actually celebrates the absolute disaster, which was the French and the Russian campaign. And I know we could talk about overtures after overtures associated with the campaign, but I think where the French and the Russians have shaken hands and said, let's forget about it, you know. And today it makes archaeology very easy to do between the Russians and the French, for example. But that relationship is very different between the Germans and the Russians today. And I'm sure that'll take a very long time to heal, and maybe it never heal. Anyway, any other questions? Right, okay. So what we're going to take, we're going to take a 10-minute break so we can all have drinky poos. And we'll go from there.
Okay. Sounds fine to me.
And I would like to say, who's up for our ghost walk on ghost stories evening on Saturday? Are you still doing it, Gillian?
Yes, I think I am.
Are you doing it, Goff?
Yeah, I may have an extra person as well.
Oh no, not another Eleanor. I tell you what, we'll test out the technology before.
No, in addition to her.
Oh God.
Oh my God, I tell you what, he's got a full stable, hasn't he?
Well, I'm a stud, am I?
That's what Gillian's been telling me. Right, so anybody else want to join us on Saturday quickly?
Hi, Mike. What time are you doing it?
7:30, and it's 5 shekels. You'll need to chuck that in the old banking account. So it's...
Buy one, get one free.
Oh, shut up. It's a lot
discount for pensioners.
Oh, yeah.
Are you
oh, right, yeah. Hang on. Yeah. It is a discounted rate, £5, because it's pensioners and children. So there you go.
Oh. Carl, are you sending a link to where we pay?
Okay, Andrew. What I will do, I'll send that link where you pay, and I'll send that to Gillian, and we'll sort that out for later. After this now. Can I just mention one thing? I haven't mentioned money for weeks because you've all paid. I had a word with Kathy last week, right? The renewal date is going to be the middle of the month, right? It's not an 8-week period, it's a 2-monthly period, okay? So April you'll be getting April you're getting a free week anyway. So any confusion on that when you get the letter, you now know the answer. So there you go. I'm gonna open my post.
Okay.
A cuppa.
This looks very ominous. And I've got a free elastic band as well. Oh, hang on. Brown envelope. And it's a brown thing. Oh my God! I've got an Archaeology Cymru rubber stamp.
Carl, are you leaving it on break?
Yeah, I'm just going to leave it on anyway, just to wind you all up.
That's okay.
I got a letter from HMRC. I wonder if here we go. Oh, here we go. It's time to fill in your tax return. Bloody hell! Great. That's brilliant. That is.
They owe you money.
They probably do. Oh, and I've got an envelope from China. I don't think I'll open that. Hang on. No, I won't open that one. Christ, I'm washing my hands. Oh, and I got some articles of the week. And guess who the articles of the week are off? Ellen. What bloody hell are you doing here, Ellen? Doing my head in. What's all this shit? Should have known that was Ellen there. Statue. What the stuff is. Where they've gone. The one jam. Guess what I've got from China? 3 face masks. Isn't that ironic? I got 3 face masks from China.
Used once.
I'm going to do my tea. I've had enough of this. That's good, that Ellen stuff. Oh, that's one. Yeah.
Behind you. Why is there a dead chicken?
What's that?
On the video of Caligula, behind you in the video, is 2 chickens' legs sticking up in the air, so you've got a dead chicken on you. Oh
right, it's the hanging chicken.
Oh.
So a little hanging chicken. Oh right, okay.
Oh, bless it.
It's a hanging chicken. It is. And do you know what? There you go. And one more time. Oh, you could go.
Karen, you missed the chickens. Karen missed the chickens.
So I'm gonna go and put my eggs back.
There last week.
Yesterday we were talking about Russians. Yesterday there was a very good.
Hang on, I've got to wash my hands. I'll be back now. Hang on, I'll be back now.
There's a really interesting documentary on BBC Two, The Countess and the Billionaire. You know, we're talking about the trickiness of the Russian people and the Russian.
Yeah.
Definitely manifested in this billionaire's behaviour towards his English wife and her family. So it was on BBC Two yesterday.
Right, was he a complete loony?
Just extremely controlling.
Oh, right. Yeah, the Russians are noted for that, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, and violent.
Yeah.
Murderous.
Also noted for that.
And there was quite a few of looking at some of the assassinations that Putin's arranged of people he's fallen out with.
Yeah, other oligarchs
who've moved to the UK. Yeah.
Mm.
So.
Oh, I missed that.
Well, it's available on Catch Up.
Oh, right.
Right.
Okay.
Okay then. Let's get straight back to my undies. I've had some press articles off the witch Ellen, so we're going to do them. So as we're straight back to it, what was the question you were asking me, glorious lady?
Which glorious lady?
You, Sue. Not Gillian. Gillian's just an old witch.
I was just flagging up that yesterday there was an interesting documentary. You mentioned the tricky nature of the Russian personality. And yesterday there was a documentary about the countess who married the Russian billionaire. And so, although it's more recent history, it really looked at some of the assassinations that Putin's arranged of people he's fallen out with who've moved to the UK. And a rather tricky husband, this Russian billionaire. So, made interesting viewing.
Well, I tell you what, any woman called Anastasia, right, give a wide berth. I've had so many messages off Anastasia on my email, right, offering me everything. and you click onto the link, right, and the Anastasia, the picture of the Anastasia that they send you, right, is another Anastasia, and the last one I clicked onto had a hairy chest.
Well, I think the thing is we never click onto anything we don't know the origin.
No, quite.
Yeah, and right, I got to mention, if anyone's got any on Wednesday afternoon, right, we had our Archaeology Cymru for juniors, and it seemed to go extremely well. And so if any of you got any annoying grandchildren or children that want to do an archaeology class on a Wednesday afternoon, please let me know. We've got one like that, haven't we, John? Anyway, so what we're going to do some articles of the week. And Karen, can I just ask you, did you say you had, there's another woman wanting to join this motley group, isn't there?
Yes, but she needs to postpone it for a couple of weeks.
Oh, okay. Nothing wrong with the postponement. The thing is, the more women, the better. That's what I say. Isn't it right, Bob?
Depends what they look like.
Joe, I got to be honest with you.
Absolutely.
For a few months, Keith was in that room all alone with all those women, and I envied him.
It was terrible. It was terrible. Don't know how I survived.
You think you can say it? Don't you?
Do you know what? The articles of the week I've been sent by Ellen are some of the ones we've already done. Remember the Easter Island one with the stony statue? Well, we've done that one.
Yeah.
And we've done the remains of the deified saint, right? But we haven't done these two. And she's taken the time to send them to me. Treasure that could rewrite history. And it's this one here. It says, Dan Jones has made a career out of talking about history, but this was one trip into the past that left him speechless. Partway through the first episode of History Channel's new 5-part series, Lost Relics of the Knights Templar, Dan Jones is taken to a secret location in the British countryside. I always offer to do that with lots of women I've met.
The women.
Yeah, exactly. There he's shown, because of what I say, this is my chat-up line. Will you come to the countryside to see my precious items?
The gold rivet.
This was the chat-up line that he had. There he's shown precious items, including a beautiful sword, picture of Lloyd George, a beautiful sword with ornate crosses on either side of the blade that have apparently been hidden from public view for nearly 802 years and 3 months. Their owners say they once belonged to a knight, to the Knights Templar, a military order set up to protect Christian pilgrims in the 11 and 1200s, until they were disbanded on the 13th of February in the year 1300. Mark that. Many thought the artifacts may have gone forever. These finds could rewrite Templar history. They're the most important finds ever found in Britain.
Ever.
If this is a real Templar find, it's mind-blowingly exciting. You know, it makes me wonder, you know, yeah. The items, Dan is told, form a part of a collection of up to 601.5 Knight Templar artifacts bought and stored over the past 10 years by English millionaires who met in Monaco. Templar artifacts are pretty rare. If these men really are sitting on 61.5 of these artifacts, people are going to lose their minds about them. So, so in other words, we're talking about a whole series dedicated to finding unusual things. And I don't know if anyone's seen the series.
I recorded it last night.
Yeah, so it's a 5-part series, Lost Relics of the Knights Templar. Yeah, so let us know
Last
about
night.
it.
What channel's that on? What channel is it, Keith?
History Channel.
Oh, History Channel, right, okay.
Yeah, because you're still paying your TV license, you won't get it. There's an irony there. Now, this is an interesting thing in the newspaper. It's obviously in The Guardian because, you know, Ellen reads The Guardian. Question, was Julius Caesar beaten in his second invasion of the British Isles despite what his own histories say? Interesting, because we did Caligula the other week. So we're going to do this verbatim. Julius Caesar invaded Britain twice. Well, obviously, and the third one, which didn't really take place in 56. So the two that we're talking about, 55 and 54 BC. Both invasions had the potential to be successful, but Caesar worried about leaving his province of Gaul unprotected during the winter. Some British tribes had allied with the Roman. Some British tribes had allied themselves with the Gauls, to whom they were kin, which was a motivation for Julius Caesar invading. Britain was also rich in minerals, particularly tin, lead, and copper. And obviously, not forgetting gold and silver. Worried by an invasion, British tribes sent ambassadors to Caesar in Gaul, promising forms of alliances. Caesar had an ally in Commius, king of the Atrebates, who lived in what is now Hampshire. For his first invasion, Caesar is said to have taken 600 ships, carrying 2 legions and cavalry, though in their haste, the legions left behind most of their baggage and all of their siege artillery. And lots of their food, I hasten to add. Having intended to land at Dover, Caesar found the cliffs defended against him, so he looked for a new landing site, and we know that being Pegwell Bay from the archaeological evidence that we looked at a few weeks ago. The landings were opposed, but skillful use of slingers and archers drove the Britons back, allowing a beachhead to be secured. The cavalry had been delayed at sea, so weren't able to pursue the retreating Britons and capitalize on the victory. Caesar was taken by surprise by the strong tides, which caused many of his ships to be damaged and stopped the cavalry from landing. This meant he was unable to consolidate his beachhead and move any significant distance inland. And the Britons attacked again twice, but were driven off. After negotiation, a tribute to be paid and hostages to be handed over, Caesar withdrew to Gaul for the winter in order to save face. In his reports, he classified it as an adventure of reconnaissance. And the second invasion went better because Julius Caesar brought 5 legions. He reached the Thames at its first viable crossing point near Brentford, but found the northern bank held against him by Cassivellaunus, king of the Trinovantes. Some accounts state a war elephant carrying slingers and archers was used against the defenders and routed them. If true, it would have been the first time such an animal would have been on our shores. An elephant wouldn't be brought here again until 1255. Caesar decided once again to withdraw from Britain. Britain would remain independent until AD 43, when 4 legions and the senator Aulus Plautius and the Roman Emperor Claudius would invade. And the problem is, when you read something like this, you've got to get really into it. And I've only just seen this. And it promised that Julius Caesar was beaten in his second invasion of Britain. Strangely enough, that's not in that thing. I didn't read it, but that's interesting. The last bit, that AD 43, and I'm saying that Caligula may have had a successful invasion in AD 40, because by AD 43, when Claudius invades, there's no resistance. And you ask the question, why? So what we're going to do, we're going to carry on. I do believe that somebody's fallen asleep. I think all these women are exhausted him. And Gillian's really upset now that, you know. So let's carry on. Now, obviously, you're all thinking now that this article is going to lead quite nicely over to, you know, saying that these are the remains of Napoleon's army. And yes, it does go there. So they excavated there for a month, and they recovered not just 1,000 skeletons, not 2,000 skeletons, but over 3,600 skeletons. And as the archaeologists were excavating, they actually started to find buttons, military medals, coins, fabric, other odds and sods. And these all related to Napoleon's Grand Army from 1812. Now, before I say any more, I need to take me back a few years when we were doing some reporting of this back in about 2002. One of the things specifically we picked up on, this is a very important point, that a year or so after, when mothers and fathers back in France and back in Italy, back in Germany, back in Spain, Portugal, there were about 20 different countries 20 different countries that made up Napoleon's Grand Army that invaded Russia. And there's reports of the literature of the day that families would visit Lithuania and Vilnius and other parts of Russia, and so on and so on. And it's said that they would go down into monasteries and churches, and bodies would be stacked up down there. And basically, the clergyman would say, well, you'll have to look amongst those bodies. We don't know which one's your son or your daughter. And this was the situation. They were still there for years after, because they just didn't have the people to bury them. There were just so many bodies. And there's other descriptions that are coming up as well. So experts in the study of mass graves from France's Centre of National Research, Scientific Research, and the University of Marseille were called in to assist the excavations and lab analysis, because it was, you know, the Lithuanian team was just, there was just too many bodies. So they brought in other experts to get the job done. Bringing with them not only expertise back in 2001, but sophisticated back then digital cameras, computers, and software that weren't generally available in Lithuania back in 2001. Remember, this was only 10 years after Lithuania had become independent, and back then Lithuania was not a very wealthy country. But now they're really good with how they do things, and particularly in their archaeology. Back in 2001, it was brilliant. And the scientists did some wonderful research involving the DNA, which we'll sort of paraphrase at the end. And one of the things that they were looking for, and it was not only the DNA of the individuals, so they could actually try and trace some of them, was actually the DNA of microorganisms. Now, this is a really good point, because as we read through this, we will note that the writer of this article is saying, actually, Napoleon was trying to say that the invasion didn't work, not use the word failed, the invasion didn't work because of the weather. But he didn't admit that the army didn't have enough food. He also didn't admit that lots of his soldiers were dying from disease. He wanted to blame the weather. He didn't want his medical staff to be blamed for any failings with the medicine in treating those who had typhus. And he certainly didn't want his quartermaster general being blamed for not having enough supplies. And there's another weird chapter with this whole episode, and the reason why people go out excavating the dead. Why do we need to excavate so many numbers of dead? Well, they were building a new structure at the site for a start, so the bodies needed to be moved for the structure to go in there. Each of these have been given a grave as well, which is great, but that's later on in the story. But one thing we don't know is how many soldiers actually made it back, and how many people died in fighting. How many people died of disease? How many people just gave up the ghost and decided to stay in Lithuania? How many actually went home to, say, Germany? How many actually just went home to Italy? The army that actually marched into Paris the following year in 2013 was reduced to about between 40 and 50,000 soldiers. Around 1/10 of the invasion army of Russia. But I don't think that's a good representation of those who actually survived. As history exaggerated the dead associated with this campaign, I don't think the answer will ever be known. But by excavating some of these large grave sites, you can get an idea of answering some of the questions. When we talk about jigsaws and we talk about wanting to statistically know everything, well, we've got some of the jigsaw pieces. Maybe as we excavate the ground, we'll be able to add some more of the jigsaw pieces and get a better idea. And the biggest problem is when we look at archaeology, is the nature of historical reporting. When Keith goes back to Waterloo, he learns something new. But why should he be learning something new? It's extensively written about. However, lots of what Keith is reading about isn't shown in the archaeology. The archaeology tells a different picture. They tell a different story. For example, at Waterloo, there's evidence coming out now that there may have been fighting at Waterloo before the actual battle. There may have been other events that change our interpretation. So if we're learning things from something that's so well reported, like Waterloo, learning new things about what's going on with his retreating army from Russia opens up so many boxes. And what we can see there is we can see one of his guard uniform buttons, which has been reattached onto a reconstruction uniform. They have actually found bits of fabric, but they found thousands of buttons, and each of these buttons tell a story, whether they were from the 21st Regiment or the 53rd Regiment, or whether they were from the old or the new guard. However, the archaeologists found out something rather interesting in the closing stages of their précis the work. They found out that most of those dead of Vilnius had never been in a battle before. They'd never been in a campaign before. Napoleon's army was made up of raw recruits who had no experience of fighting. That's another level to the story. And the level to the story is that with inexperience, that led the army to be inexperienced. It's a bit like the First World War. First few months of the First World War, the Expeditionary Force, these people were experienced. These people had fought in the Boer War. They'd fought in campaigning in Africa. Some of them had, some of them had actually been involved in much earlier conflicts in the Zulu War and stuff. But by the December of the First World War in 1914, these were just raw recruits going into battle, like lambs to the slaughter. And lots of those involved in the campaigning turned out in Russia to be those lambs to the slaughter. So what the archaeologists were working within a tight deadline, within a 98 foot long trench by 20 feet in depth trench. This is more likely to have been the ditch of the town defences that were filled in by these soldiers. Bodies, and was just simply backfilled and forgotten about. And that's the interesting thing. We don't know where most of the people buried from this conflict are to be found. It's true to say that the way of fighting in the Napoleonic War after the battle was that somebody might go in, collect a few bodies together, put them in a burial mound, but lo and behold, lots of bodies were just left on the battlefield. And it stands to reason that we don't really understand the Napoleonic War as much as we think we do. So this was in April 2001, and the real estate developers by May were developing it on the site. But they were able to get the funding involved to actually look at the bodies, which was great. The grim story of Napoleon's retreat from Russia in the winter of 1812, it says is well known, but there's a big unknown in the well known, as we've already explained. The figures change there. I started the lecture saying it was 400,000 soldiers, and then there's another figure of 650,000, and in this source it says 450,000. We don't really know. You know, if I wanted to give a few ballpark figures, 100,000 died in fighting, right? So that leaves 50,000 returned. 50,000 went home to other places, so that accounts for 200,000. 50,000 died of the cold. 50,000 died of typhus. We don't really know. We don't have any idea. But these were people from Italy who had been places that had been conquered by Napoleon's armies. Spain, Croatia, Germany, even Africa. 15 to 20 countries sent regiments into Napoleon's Grand Army. The parallel could be made with the German army invading Russia in the Second World War. It wasn't just the German army invading Russia. There was Spanish there, there were Italians there, there were Bulgarians there, there were English there as well. There were loads of different people invading with Germany's army in the Second World War. And when I say English, yeah, we had people who did enlist in the German army in the Second World War. So those stories are repeated, and we don't really understand those stories, and parts of those stories are not really told. The retreat from Moscow to Vilnius in Lithuania lasted from the 19th of October, from Moscow itself, until December. And it's said by one sergeant of 50,000 soldiers that he was aware of, that 20,000 actually died at Vilnius itself. So that leaves 30,000. That's the ones that we're talking about. And it said, and here we go, it said that on December 9th, we started out for Vilnius with a temperature of minus 20 degrees Celsius. And I think the temperatures are actually written down there wrong. If anyone knows your Fahrenheits and your Celsiuses, out of 2 divisions totaling over 10,000 men, only 2,000 actually made it to Vilnius. The hope of making it to the city where we were to find food in abundant supply had restored strength in me, or rather, like my fellow men, I produced supernatural efforts to make it there. And that's an interesting point. One thing is, these soldiers have been welcomed there in July and August in the year 1812. But when I got there in December 1812, the people of Vilnius were thinking, why have you turned up on our doorstep? We don't have enough food to feed our own people. We may have welcomed you a few months earlier, but can you please sod off? And that's one thing that's not written in these texts. The French soldiers felt that there would be food there in abundant supply. There was, but not their own. And, you can imagine that the people of Vilnius are just, the one thing they want to do is get rid of the French soldiers. because after them, guess what's going to turn up? The bloody Russian soldiers, right? And they're going to be back to where they started. So a nice little collection here of buttons. And one thing that we can tell is from the buttons where these regiments originated from, and from the DNA as well. We can tell that you know, we can track some people down, and also from the strontium analysis, we can actually tell that 99% of all the people in that ditch come from outside Russia. Most of them from the West, most of them from Spain or France. So what we've got buttons there. We've got a silver Napoleonic 5-franc coin. And the question is, you all need to ask, is why are they finding coins associated with these bodies? Well, when your body starts to shut down, you go into you start to crouch. You go into a position that you're dealing with the agony of being really cold, and with that, as your body completely shuts down and the frost gets to you, your body completely freezes. So anyone trying to loot your body for coinage or buttons is going to find a very hard job. And it's just said that bodies were just picked up and just tossed into the ditch as soon as these people were dead. And you know, by the time they get into Vilnius, you know, the soldiers are very mixed. You get one soldier from the 53rd, another soldier from the 12th. You have a cavalry officer. You might have a general wandering the streets without their horse, and all ranks disappear. You're going to have camp followers as well, which are both men and women. And one important point that I made on Tuesday was that you know, the generals' wives. It's reported that one or two generals' wives, after their husbands had died, went in amongst the ranks and marched with the soldiers, and they felt safe because no man would have wanted to rape them when they didn't even want to take their clothes off. So they felt perfectly safe. But the women had to fend for themselves as well, even though they'd been the wives of generals. And what we then find is amongst the male dead, we actually find women as well. We find camp followers, we find some of the senior officers' wives and so on. So it's a tragedy, and we actually find one or two children as well who had actually followed their fathers into battle. And the age of lots of these soldiers were actually conscripts as well. And one thing that has to be said is you could have a drummer boy that could be 14, 15 years old. So some of these were children going into battle with Napoleon's Grand Army. So here we go. There we go. The city that welcomed Napoleon on June the 28th. 6 months later, we have these entries. And I've always felt that the person writing this text, he writes, now saw his decimated army return from its disastrous campaign in Russia. Anyone that knows their Latin's decimus, basically 1,800 years earlier, if you'd been in the Roman army and you'd revolted, one of you would take a lot. 1 in 10 of you would be executed. The irony is that only 1 in 10 actually returned. Not 9 in 10, 1 in 10. What is less well known is what happened to those who perished, which is very, very right. So here we go. I thought this could be a unique chance for independent and objective testing of the often biased and incomplete historic sources. Because from the Russian point of view, from the Lithuanian point of view, from the English point of view, from the French point of view, from everyone's point of view, there's a biased way of looking at this history. There's a biased way of looking at this conflict. There's always another way of looking at what happened in a war. From a human point of view, I felt sorry for those men. I would say those women as well. From a professional point of view, I was excited. I never thought I would have so many skeletons in front of me. Although war is generally considered a man's job, there are certainly a number of females in the grave. What was the role of women in the military campaign? And do historical sources neglect or underestimate their role? By examining their bodies, this is to give us an idea, to give us an overview, to give us a view of history that we haven't found elsewhere. And again, looking in this source as well, one of the best descriptions of the desperate conditions of Vilnius during the winter of 1812, December, in a journal of General Robert Wilson, who's a British military observer who had been a military attaché to Lithuania at the time. So, you know, he's in amongst the French, an enemy of the French. He's in amongst the French. And he visits a monastery in Vilnius. And it said that the French had turned the monastery into a makeshift hospital. And this is what he writes. The hospital at St. Basil presented the most awful and hideous sight. 7,500 bodies were piled like pigs of lead over one another in the corridors. And all the broken windows and walls were stuffed with feet, legs, arms, hands, trunks, and heads to fit the apertures and keep out the air from the yet living. And the irony is that final two words, yet living. He knows that many people who are there alive are not going to survive long either. They're in agony, and they're not able to call out because they're so cold. A little bit more about what's going on as well. At first, the people of Vilnius cremated the thousands of bodies piling up all over the city. So we can learn now, the one important point is that the archaeology tells us that thousands of soldiers got to Vilnius. And the next sentence is something that I've already said, right? Even though thousands of them got to Vilnius, over 20,000 of them, over 50,000 and 20,000 of them died. They had managed to get to sanctuary, but they still died. There was food there. They still died. So even if Napoleon had managed to get the Russians to surrender, it's unlikely that most of these would have returned anyway. Most of them didn't have winter gear, and it's the same thing for the Second World War as well.
Thank you for your cooperation.
I don't know. Has somebody got a TV in the background? Something about cooperation?
It's the police van.
It was the police van.
Yeah, it's the police van going around. I heard it here a few minutes ago.
Oh, are they? So, okay, fair enough.
Keep off the streets. Keep off the streets. The Yellow Death will get you.
Oh, you just did a Donald Trump, the Yellow Death. That's unacceptable. So here we go. It was overwhelming. The smell was completely overwhelming. They were burying their dead in mass graves, all just chucked into cesspits or just chucked into ditches. Nobody was given any sense of any last rites. Most of those in the graves that were excavated, you know, the 3,600, turned out to be between 15 and 20 years old. Forensic analysis shows few were veterans of previous campaigns, and those that had been veterans were the ones who survived. There's descriptions of the old soldiers marching into Paris in 1813. These weren't boys. These were those who had actually survived because they'd been in other battles. As some of the historical records had indicated, but not all of them, soldiers with long experience often suffered foot fractures, and their bones show signs of healing. Those tassels, those feet bones of those young soldiers showed no signs of trauma, except maybe one or two of their little appendages had actually been lost through frostbite. But there was no sign that they'd ever done anything like this before. Marching week after week does have its toll on the feet. It is clear that many soldiers died from the cold, as some of the skeletons were found in the fetal position. This is the the position that you're going to take. Some scholars believe Napoleon exaggerated the harshness of the winter to make his defeat and the staggering loss of life appear beyond his control. As I said, was it as cold as he said? Was it in fact the other things he wanted to cover up? The skeletons corroborate historical accounts that the winter was extremely cold, but how cold and how people lost their lives is another question. Many soldiers also died of starvation. The army had taken little food with it during the retreat and traveled across a countryside devastated by the Russian scorched earth campaign. According to some accounts, soldiers went to the went to the medical school in Vilnius and took out the alcohol preserved organs of various animals there for anatomy students to study in the glass containers and actually ate them.
Oh God.
So, you know, they managed to get to Vilnius. Food soon ran out, and they were trying to eat what they could. It is almost certain that many of the soldiers died of typhus, a disease often called war fever, because of its close association with filthy wartime conditions. The presence or absence of typhus may be determined by the DNA study to be conducted by French scholars. We know that typhus is present. We know from, this is 2001, 2002, 2015, we know that the typhus DNA is actually present. Unfortunately, with typhus, it's not going to show any signs on the bone record because it's, you know, it's not that. It's an organ failure virus, and it's not going to have much effect on the bone record, but the DNA is going to be there. So, you know, when we look at the body at St. Bees, you know, and I said that the archaeologists didn't treat it with respect, and respect is shown with these bodies, you know, because they know that terrible things, some of these people died of terrible things, and, you know, it says it all. Scientific value of these skeletons and the work done under extreme pressure within these unceremonial burials afterwards, after the study and the study of these bodies are buried alongside the war heroes in Vilnius' cemetery. One by one, they're buried, and it's almost as if they've got a fitting tribute years and years after. What we're going to do, I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to look at some more bits and pieces of things that we haven't covered, and then we're going to call it a day. So here we go. So let's get to my doodah. Hang on a minute. I'm a little bit, here we go. Oh, there's my images. Right, so a little bit more information. I can't see you at this moment, but can you all see me?
Yeah.
Good.
Fortunately.
Shut up, you tart.
Can you see us?
Do you know what I'm going to do? You're going to look at these images, and I'm going to read you the last bit of text, okay? That's what we're going to do. So here we go. Because some of you annoy me, including Keith. So here we go. Look at this image here. They're excavating in all conditions and giving you in the snow and all sorts of conditions. Vilnius snowing in April, and there's a wonderful graph online that shows, which I haven't been able to get to grips with, but there you go. The bodies, the mass grave image of the mass grave that we're actually showing here. Bodies after bodies, articulated, disarticulated. Back in the day, they're just tossed into the ground. And here we go. And there you go. Just that story of those limbs and that trying to encompass what this is about. And there's some text. And there you go. It's wonderful to be working as an archaeologist in Lithuania. And some of the other things as well. You've got whole sets of surviving headgear. The only thing missing with this is the plume of feathers on the front. The 21st Line Infantry Regiment. This is where this would be the Line Infantry Regiment, and these would be the cannon fodder of Napoleon's army. And look at this here, pewter buttons. This would be a rank and file soldier, probably a blue uniform rather than a grey as shown there because it's been bleached. And there you go, examining these bodies one by one. But obviously this is something that can be done after. The whole point is to remove the bodies, get them safe, and then study them. So that's what's being done. And there you go. This is them given the last rite, the last sense of closure in the war cemetery. And what we're going to do now, we don't want to do that. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing. And I'm going to finish my notes up now. And I'm just going to look at some notes. And so coming up to 2015 today, you know, in the original reports, it didn't say the other stuff. You know, when you look at reports back in the day, it always goes silver, gold, you know, buttons and stuff. But lots of shoes were found, lots of items of clothing. And within that one mass grave alone, they found buttons and bodies associated with 40 different regiments: infantry, artillery, cavalry, pioneer regiments from all across the Napoleonic world. Now, one little fact that most people don't know about is why Napoleon invaded Russia. And it's quite simple. Napoleon invaded Russia because Tsar Alexander I kept threatening to invade Poland. As you know, lots of people have attempted to invade Poland in history, right? And Napoleon was afraid that the Russians were going to invade Poland. To stop the Russians invading Poland, he decided to invade Russia. And when he got to Moscow, the Tsar refused to capitulate or surrender. And lots of sources are given, you know, and I think I'm going to set a little bit of homework for Keith. Keith, can you look at every single battle in the Russian campaign and tot up the numbers of French dead for me, please? That's your homework for next week. And I know it can be done. All 20-odd field ending actions, there's about 20-odd. So if you can add up all the dead, I would be very grateful. So
I will see what I can do for you.
You're going to do it. I know.
How much are you going to pay me?
You get a big sloppy kiss.
Oh, and a hug.
And a hug, yeah. No, not a hug.
Okay.
You
That's
might
a deal.
Yeah, exactly. So, so not only have we got starvation and typhus, we've got hypothermia, 20,000 soldiers. And what we've got, the exact number, I've been saying it's 3,600 for the whole lecture, 3,269 of the number completely found in 1 month in 2001. And they intensely sampled 24 of them at the same time, examining all of them in different ways and forms. And the numbers that they intensely focused on using oxygen isotopic analysis and strontium analysis to work out the geographical area and the food requirements of these individuals showed that lots of those in the pit were not only the rank and file, but lots of them had had a good diet. So there was a few officers buried amongst them as well. And they actually found that one individual from the oxygen values associated with the bone structure had actually been one person who had been in a former campaign, who had actually been in the African campaign. So they actually, out of the 24, the 2 dozen they thoroughly examined intricately. This one person had actually fought with Napoleon in Egypt. So, and then what they did, they started looking more intensely at the overview of all the bodies. Because what we do in archaeology, we do a bit of a triage thing. We study the ones that we can study, then we do an overview of all the others. and 3,269 bodies is a lot. So you've got to take a sample, in other words. But what they did more of an intense sample. They particularly sampled the femurs of a number of individuals. They found out that when they brought the sample down to 76 individuals, 73 were males and 3 were females. And they started to do an overview, and they basically started to say, well, maybe about 5% of the full collection is actually female. So, you know, out of the 20,000, you've got a few hundred women being buried there, which is quite an interesting analogy. There were probably more women associated with Napoleon's army than we could have ever thought before. And what they found out as well, to prove this thing that Napoleon took Italian soldiers, Spanish soldiers with him, when they started to examine the bone structures and the stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes within the bones, all that new technology that we're learning about, they actually found out that that certain of Napoleon's soldiers had a diet of wheat. Others of Napoleon's army had a diet of millet. So wheat's going to be French soldiers. Millet's going to be Italian soldiers. And by looking at the isotopic values, you're able to work out where these people actually come from, which is absolutely amazing. You're also able to work out as well that some of the bones were associated with people who had a high carnivorous diet. Basically, they were eating a lot of meat. And if you're eating a lot of meat in, say, France, you're in the hierarchy of society. If you're then eating a highly vegetable diet, it's very likely with a very high vegetable diet that you might actually be within the ranks, the lowly ranks. And what we're actually finding is that one of the women was found out that she had prolonged morning sickness at one stage in her life. Amazing that. So obviously it's a woman. And we're able to work out that some of the soldiers weren't in good health even before the campaign. Some of the soldiers showed signs that they had vitamin D deficiency. So we're building up a higher picture now. We're seeing that not only everything that I've said, but some of the soldiers, if not lots of the soldiers, weren't in good health before they invaded Russia. So not only did you have people who weren't equipped properly food-wise, they didn't have the right clothing, they didn't have the right boots, they weren't in the right level of health, and also they were riddled with louse, and this was cause for the absolute destruction of the army. Epidemic typhus. So obviously the loss of body water through urine, sweat, and diarrhea. And, you know, these people really, really suffered. Even if they had access to food, they wouldn't have lasted long anyway. And, you know, other little things as well. I'm going to read this out here. What caused the high nitrogen values analyzed from some of these soldiers from the Grand Army? It could be the result of consumption of marine resources or from starvation. So in other words, when you're starving, you've got a high nitrogen value in your bones, or if you're eating a large amount of fish, that also gives you a high nitrogen value. There was no large-scale tinning of food back then. I know that tinned food was starting to come in the later period of the Napoleonic War, but probably little tin food, and even then the cans would have been lined with lead. It's possible that soldiers could have carried salted, dried cod, but more likely they were simply starving. So in other words, the nitrogen value in the bone structure, the isotopic nitrogen value in the bone structure, and the teeth and all the rest of it. If you're starving, you have a high nitrogen value. If you've eaten a lot of fish, you have a high nitrogen value. When you're eating fish, it's likely that you don't have access to red meat and so on. So all those different things give us a picture. The prolonged periods of starvation possibly stem from career-long military service, or the fact that people weren't eating a great deal before they went into battle. It's called nutritional stress prior to military conscription or at the point of conscription. All these wonderful things learned. And who were the women? Well, we've mentioned lots of the wives. I wouldn't say that a prostitute would be very useful in this campaign, to be honest with you. Because the last thing I'd want to do is have sex with somebody if I'm freezing cold, and if I take my clothes off, all my bits are going to fall off. So there were plenty of camp followers who were providing other roles. They were running the kitchens. They were medical people. They may have sold goods to the soldiers. Finding the remains of women in this mass grave means archaeologists can add to the historical record, which largely glosses over women's experiences of the war. Hugely glosses over the women's experiences of the war. You know, when we look at, okay then, I'm going to share, I watched the Sharp series about 100 times, right? And the one thing we see in the Sharp series, the only role that a woman has in the Napoleonic War is behind the lines, to do terrible things to the French soldiers, when in fact there were lots of women in the ranks, and there were lots of women helping the ranks. There were lots of women accompanying their men. We do have women who were enlisted in these armies as well. The soldiery role. Now, when we look at there's a lot of pro-Napoleonic scholars. They basically blame the collapse of the Russian campaign on the cold Russian winter. Never criticize Napoleon, never blame Napoleon for this. But the military logistics at the time were incapable of supporting an army of this size. Even considering that living off the land, stealing from locals, the modus operandi of Napoleon's armies, it was impossible. You know, one army would go through a village, you know, Napoleon's army. So a few thousand men would go through a village, take everything, and then you got another 1,000 men. There's nothing left for them. And then after that, there's nothing left for them either. So you can't steal and eat off the land, and it makes the locals very resentful. So these are all nice little bits of evidence for the campaign, preserving the memories of these men and women.
Can I add?
And what we're going to do, we're going to add you because your ad will be added to my bit, and then I'll add a bit to your bit, and then we'll ask questions. Go on, Keith.
The French army also had official women attached to each regiment called cantinières. So they were officially employed by the regiment, not prostitutes, but they helped mend the men's clothes, did cooking, nursed them when they were injured, and they wore an official uniform that was designed for them by the actual regiment.
Keith, did you ever collect that Dalrado series of Napoleonic soldiers? I got the complete set of 100. Did you do that?
I didn't actually, no, but I do have lots of other ones.
There was a cantinière with them, and if I can dig it out, she's got a little whiskey barrel on her side. And,
yeah, brandy, yeah.
Yeah. And the weird thing is, in that entire collection, there's only, I think she's the only woman in amongst 100. Women are completely so underrepresented in history. And it's a huge shame because I think the question I've asked Keith about the dead through these battles, it always says, you know, soldiers dead. It doesn't actually say, you know, female, the cantinières, you know, these are dead as well, you know, or they just put in with the man, you know, it's that understated history. I'm not a massive feminist, but I feel that the woman's role in history is so underpainted. That's why I've managed to look at a lot of female figures in history as well recently. I was going to say one last thing, one tragedy, and I think this completes it actually. When the Napoleonic soldiers are retreating and they're welcomed into villages that they had been 2 months earlier or 3 months earlier, and they'd taken everything from the villagers. The villagers made them suffer. They made French soldiers starve to death. They locked them in rooms to make the French suffer for the way they were suffering. However, is that French publicity against the Russians? Did that happen or did it not? We need more evidence to prove lots of the things that archaeologists, historians say about this campaign. But we've got truly evidence to add to the jigsaw to understand this absolute disaster. And one thing I've forgotten to mention as well, right, is that the Russian civilians really suffered in this campaign as well. If you think about Leonid Tolstoy's War and Peace, Leonid Tolstoy does a balance. He says, we are suffering. The French army isn't just suffering, we are suffering, the people. And the people did suffer. And maybe as many people died as French soldiers and as Russian soldiers. So I think that's another forgotten area of history. I don't think we can close that one yet. Right, are there any questions?
No.
Okay.
Andrea, any questions? No. Any John?
No questions.
Right. Okay. This has been absolutely fantastic today, having this turnout. I had a little meeting last night, and Michelle said, "Do you really have to go back to teaching classes in person?" And I said, "Well, I've got to, because Gillian misses me, Jane misses me, Goff misses his hugs.
I like the cat.
Jim misses the love. You know, is that a real cat?"
Yeah, she's a real cat. This is Mabel. Mabel.
Oh, she's gorgeous.
Bloody huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, couldn't do that with my cat.
Oh, right. Okay, fair enough. Right, I tell you what, I want a question off Gillian, even if she hasn't got one.
What? You want a question off me?
Even though you haven't got one, go on.
I haven't got one, no. But it was very interesting. I liked it.
I'm glad you like that.
Voice.
Sadam?
I've got a croaky voice. I think it's hay fever. I hope
We hope it is.
it is.
I hope it don't be kissing Goff. Right, let's have one more question. Somebody shout out a question, and then we'll wind it up in 2 minutes.
How many beans make 5?
4.5.
That's right. You get the prize.
Yeah. Finally, did you spot all 5 Dennises in the newsletter?
No.
Bless him.
Well, okay, then I'll give you a clue. There's 2 on the front cover. And next month we're doing Spot the Barbara, and the following month we're doing Spot the Bill, and the following month we're doing Spot the Kathy.
Sounds good to me.
Anyone who's got any articles, let me know. So
yeah, I'll post them off.
So if anyone, as I say, if anyone wants to join the Ghost Doodah on Saturday, can you stay behind after the class? What we're going to do, who needs to stay behind to talk about the ghostly thing? Goff? Andrea?
I want to go on the ghost thing,
just
but
see you.
get this one out, getting fidgety.
Okay, I'll tell you what, those are Gillian, Sue,
Yeah, I'll stay as well.
Andrea,
I'll
and
watch
John stay behind. If those rest of you don't want to do the ghost thing, what I'm going to say before anyone goes, we're doing the next week we're doing the Archaeology of England tour, which will be really something different, because we don't look at the Archaeology of England tour at all, and it is out there. Have you all enjoyed today?
Yes.
Rubbish. Rubbish.
Good. And as I say, if anyone ever misses a class in a Thursday morning, they can join the one on the afternoon, but I wouldn't advise it. Or they can join the Skype class on a Tuesday. And if anyone's got any youngsters that wants to join my my junior archaeology thing on a Wednesday afternoon, they need to stay behind as well. So those that need to go, we'll count out one by one. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. So Jane, we're going to say goodbye to you first.
Bye.
Goodbye, Jane.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye. And then we're going to say goodbye to Jim. Goodbye, Jim.
Bye, Jim.
Bye, Jim.
Bye, Jim. And we're going to then say goodbye to Pam. It's goodbye, Pam.
Bye, Pam.
Bye, Pam.
Bye,
You're supposed to be
Pam.
going, you know. And then we're going to say goodbye to Keith. Goodbye, Keith.
Bye, Keith. Bye, bye, bye.
Who's left now? Who wants to talk to me? And Karen, have you got a dash now?
No, I want to stay and do the ghost thing on Saturday.
Right. So, Pam, if you want to hear about this, you're welcome. But we've all said goodbye, Pam, anyway. And right, so the ghost thing. Right. So who have we got? I need to do a new list. So we've got a Sue wants to do it.
Yep. Yep.
We want to do a Karen.
Yep.
We want to do a Goff. We want to do an Andrea. Actually, Pam can join us, actually, because it's online. So what am I saying? If she wants to join us, she can. John will be joining us anyway. There'll be Gillian, and so that's it's all I'm all at his wars. Sue and Karen and John and Goff, and I'm not sure about Pam, but you can message me, Pam, and let me know. Right. So what I'm going to need to do is I'll have all your email thingamajigs. Last week, the problem is last week was that Zoom had changed its policy and we had to give everyone a PIN number. So you'll be doing the same as this. In other words, it's the same access details as you've used today. You own that anyway. And the way that'll work for about an hour and a quarter, we'll be talking about the history, archaeology, and ghost stories associated with the Battle of Cowbridge. And that'll then lead us then in for the lecture next week about Owen Glyndŵr, because you'll know so much more about Owen Glyndŵr, and you'll be able to have that as well. It's as I say, we'll log on about 7:15, 7:20. It starts at 7:30, and if you've got any friends that want to join us, it's £5, and we can cope up with 100 people. And having 11 people today has worked. It's really worked well. I've got no complaints with that. We could never do this with Skype. And if those that need to pay, you can either pay via PayPal. Have you all got PayPal?
No. No.
We don't do PayPal. Can you do backs, bill payment?
No.
Right. So in that case,
I could, but I can always send you a check because I've got your address.
Right. Who wants to send a check for £5?
I do.
Yeah.
I'll probably have to. I'll try doing a bank transfer, but I might end up having to do a check.
Karen, Sue, Gillian can send a check.
Do a transfer.
Goff will do it from the bank. John will do it from the bank. And how are you going to do it, Andrea? Oh, she's gone. Okay.
Money.
When I mentioned money, she disappeared. Right, so Goff and John will do it via via bank transfer, and you three do it via the post. But I'm going to do. I wouldn't be a salesman without doing the heavy sales piece, right?
Come on.
So the heavy sales piece is right. If I go on to I know you wait. You've got me talking about money. I didn't want to do this. Oh, I started talking about money, didn't I, Andrea? So when we go on our website, which I'm going to show you, let's go on our website. Here we go. Share screen. This is our Ghost Walk website, right? Right. So what we're going to do. This is our pandemic site. We do put some of the videos online, and if we well, the first one is Cowbridge. Then the next one is Liz Werney. We will tell you about why. Huh? Towards the end of this story. Hang on, man. I'm talking twice. And an hour had passed. Here we go. Right. So what we've got, the first one is this. This is Cowbridge Stalling Down this Saturday. Then the next week is Liz Werney, UNE. Then we're doing a Barry one, where it's not going to be suicides and murders. We're doing Marcross, Lantrisson, St. Nicholas, Aberthorpe, Ogmore, Maesteg. If you wanted to do any of those, right, you may as well bung a check in for more than a £5. So if you want, you know,
Yeah.
saves you.
Yeah, that makes sense for me. I'll make a check out for 40.
Right. Okay. So if you want to do the full lot, it's 40 quid. But if you want to do
Yeah.
one, it's a fiver. If you want to do two, it's 10 quid. If you want to do whatever. So if you want to do that, then it's up to you. It makes it easier for you guys. But don't just send me if you're going to send me a check, right on the back, this is a fiver for, you know, Saturday, or it's a tenner for 2 weeks, or it's 40 quid. Just do that, and that would be really helpful.
Yeah. Okie dokie.
Anything you want to ask about that today?
Is that the same joining as this? So you'll send us an email with the link, yeah?
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Carl,
Go on, Goff.
if Eleanor and Catherine want to come on Saturday, I'll forward the email to them and put the money into your account, okay?
Good. And the other thing as well is, right, what if we're all friends of yours, Goff, right? Does it mean you pay for everyone?
I get it back otherwise.
Oh, Gillian, I know where your money's coming from.
Right, goodbye.
I'm going now. So does everyone need to ask anything else before you go?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Which account is it? Is it the Archaeology Cymru one?
I tell you what, stay there, Karen. We'll have a chat, all right? So anyway, those that need to go now, Karen and I think Sue, those that needs to go. Goodbye, Gillian and Goff.
Bye.
All right, bye.
You going, John? John's gone, and Pam's still there. So right, Gillian's still there. I tell you what, Gillian looks really good today. Those glasses look really fetching and sexy.
Shut up.
She looked. I'm saying this now because Goff isn't here. You see, so.
I want to ask what Karen asked. Who do we make the
account?
check out to for the ghost walks?
Make it payable to Karl-James Langford because we don't have access to our Archaeology Cymru account now because Barclays is closed.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
so likewise, Carl, if I do a bank transfer, I'll try a bank transfer. Is that to your personal account rather than the Archaeology Cymru one?
Right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to shut down this. I'm going to shut down the recording now. So I'll give you this out now.